Have you ever tasted a meal that saved lives, cooked by hands that once pulled drowning sailors from burning waters? That's exactly what happened when Navy recruits thought Frank Martinez was just another forgotten kitchen worker until an Admiral walked in and froze at the sight of something that changed everything. What unfolded next exposed decades of hidden heroism, and proved that sometimes the most extraordinary people choose the most ordinary jobs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The steam rose thick and heavy from the industrial grills at Naval Station Pearl Harbor's Building 47 mess hall, carrying with it the familiar aroma of bacon, hash browns and fresh coffee that had become the morning soundtrack for over 3,000 sailors, Marines and recruits stationed on the base. The massive kitchen hummed with mechanical precision at 4:30 in the morning, when most of Hawaii still slept under a blanket of Pacific darkness. But Frank Martinez had been awake for an hour already, moving through his morning routine with the kind of methodical care that spoke of decades spent feeding hungry people. At 65, Frank cut an unremarkable figure against the stainless steel backdrop of the mess hall kitchen. Average height, weathered hands, salt and pepper hair kept neat beneath a worn white cap that had seen better years. His uniform was always clean, always pressed, despite the inevitable stains that came with working over hot griddles and bubbling fryers. There was something about the way he moved though, something deliberate and measured that set him apart from the younger kitchen staff who hurried through their tasks with the urgency of people trying to get somewhere else. Frank never seemed to be in a hurry. He arrived first, left last, and in between those bookends of his day, he created what many consider the best breakfast on any military base in the Pacific. His pancakes were legendary among the morning crowd, perfectly golden, fluffy enough to absorb without becoming soggy, substantial enough to fuel a full day of training. His coffee was strong without being bitter, his eggs cooked exactly to order whether you wanted them scrambled loose or over easy with intact yolks. But it wasn't just the technical skill that made Frank's food special, there was something else, something that people couldn't quite name but always felt. Care, maybe. Attention. The sense that someone was putting genuine effort into making their morning just a little bit better. The recruits from Delta 7 Barracks had discovered Frank's breakfast at station about 3 weeks into their basic training program. Like most 18 and 19-year-olds thrust into military life, they formed quick judgments about everyone around them, categorizing people into useful or useless, cool or uncool, worth their time or beneath their notice. Frank, with his quiet demeanor and unassuming presence, had fallen squarely into the last category for most of them. He was just the old guy who flipped their pancakes and poured their coffee. Nothing more, nothing less. Tyler Brooks had been the first to start making jokes. Tyler was the kind of recruit who'd grown up with a phone in his hand and a need to document every moment of his life for social media validation. Tall, lean, with the kind of confident swagger that masked deep insecurity, Tyler had quickly established himself as the unofficial leader of his recruit group through a combination of loud opinions and carefully curated online content. His TikTok account, where he posted videos of military life with irreverent commentary, had gained a modest following among other young service members and military wannabes. It started innocently enough. Tyler noticed that Frank worked alone most mornings, handling the breakfast rush with quiet efficiency while other kitchen staff managed different stations. There was something about Frank's solitary focus that Tyler found amusing. Here was this old man, probably pushing retirement age, still getting up before dawn to cook eggs for people young enough to be his grandchildren. Tyler began making comments to his fellow recruits as they moved through the breakfast line. "Check out the fossil," Tyler would whisper, loud enough for others to hear but not quite loud enough to reach Frank's ears. "Bet he's been flipping the same pancakes since Vietnam." His friends would chuckle, and Tyler would feel that familiar rush of being the center of attention, the guy who could make others laugh with his observations about the world around them. Mason Wright and Alex Torres quickly became Tyler's most reliable audience. Mason was smaller, quieter, the kind of person who felt more confident when standing next to someone with Tyler's natural charisma. Alex had grown up in a military family, and should have known better, but the social dynamics of recruit life had a way of overriding better judgment. When Tyler made jokes, Mason and Alex laughed. When Tyler pointed out something he found ridiculous or outdated, they nodded in agreement. It was easier than standing apart, easier than being the recruit who didn't fit in with the group. Frank, for his part, seemed oblivious to the mockery. He continued his morning routine without deviation, arriving before anyone else, preparing the griddles and coffee machines, checking inventory, and setting up his station for the breakfast rush. When the recruits came through his line, he greeted them with the same professional courtesy he showed everyone else. "Good morning. How do you want your eggs? Pancakes today?" His voice was gravelly but warm, the result of decades of smoking cigarettes he'd given up 20 years ago, and morning conversations that started before most people were awake. The first time Tyler decided to record Frank was on a Tuesday morning in late May. The Hawaiian sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, and the mess hall was filling with the usual mix of early risers and people who'd been pulled from their beds by the unforgiving demands of military schedules. Tyler had positioned himself near the end of the breakfast line with his phone discreetly angled toward Frank's station. His plan was simple: capture some footage of the old cook going through his routine, add some sarcastic commentary, and post it to his growing collection of military life content. What Tyler caught on camera was Frank in his element. The older man moved with surprising grace for someone his age, managing multiple orders simultaneously, keeping track of different preferences without writing anything down, maintaining perfect timing so that eggs, bacon and pancakes all finished cooking at the same moment. His hands were steady, his movements economical, and there was something almost meditative about watching him work. But Tyler saw none of that artistry. He saw only an old man doing a simple job, and he began crafting the narrative he would layer over the footage later. Morning entertainment. Tyler captioned the video he posted that afternoon. "Our mess hall's got this ancient dude, who probably learned to cook during the Civil War."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Moves like he's underwater, talks like he's got marbles in his mouth, but hey, at least the pancakes are decent. Probably because he's been making the same recipe since dinosaurs roamed the earth." The video gained modest traction among Tyler's followers, mostly other young military personnel, who appreciated his irreverent take on base life. The comments ranged from laughing emojis to stories about similar old-timers at other bases. A few people defended Frank, noting that experienced cooks were valuable assets, but those voices were drowned out by the general amusement at Tyler's portrayal of the kitchen worker as a living fossil stubbornly clinging to relevance. Encouraged by the response, Tyler began making Frank a regular feature of his content. He'd film the cook during busy morning rushes, capturing moments when Frank seemed to move slowly or appeared confused by a recruit's special request. Tyler developed a running commentary about Grandpa Griddle, as he'd started calling Frank, turning the cook's quiet competence into a source of entertainment for his online audience. The other kitchen staff began to notice the attention Frank was receiving, though Frank himself seemed unaware of his newfound internet fame. Sarah Chen, a petty officer second class who supervised the mess hall's morning operations, had worked alongside Frank for nearly 2 years, and had developed deep respect for his professionalism and skill. Sarah was 32, a career Navy woman, who'd worked her way up through the enlisted ranks with a combination of technical competence and natural leadership ability. She had a sharp eye for both efficiency and morale, and she was beginning to sense that something was affecting the normally smooth dynamics of her morning crew. Sarah first became aware of Tyler's videos when one of the junior kitchen staff showed her the Grandpa Griddle content on his phone during a break. The young sailor thought the videos were harmless fun, maybe even good publicity for their mess hall, but Sarah felt an immediate prickle of unease. She watched Tyler's mockery of Frank's age and mannerisms, saw the comments from viewers who joined in the ridicule, and felt something protective rise in her chest. Frank Martinez was one of the most reliable, skilled and dedicated people she'd ever worked with. The idea that he was being turned into internet comedy without his knowledge bothered her on multiple levels. Over the following days, Sarah began paying closer attention to the interactions between Frank and the recruits, particularly Tyler's crew. She noticed the subtle way they positioned themselves to get the best angles for filming, the way they would repeat requests, or ask unnecessary questions to capture Frank's responses, the barely contained laughter that followed their visits to his station. Frank, with his characteristic focus on his work, seemed oblivious to the performance being staged around him, but Sarah could see the toll it was taking in small ways. Frank's shoulders carried a slight additional tension, his responses to the recruits became more clipped and professional, and she caught him once or twice posing in his work with an expression she couldn't quite read. The breaking point came on a Friday morning, when Tyler decided to escalate his content. Instead of simply filming Frank's routine, he began asking deliberately confusing questions designed to make the older man appear adult or out of touch. Tyler approached Frank's station with his phone recording, and launched into an elaborate order filled with millennial slang and references to social media trends, speaking quickly and using terminology he knew Frank wouldn't understand. "Yeah, so I want my eggs to be like totally fire, you know. Can you make them Instagram worthy, maybe add some of that aesthetic drizzle, make it pop for the gram? And can the pancakes be stacked high enough for a good TikTok transition? I'm trying to go viral with my breakfast content, so everything needs to be straight bussin', if you know what I mean." Frank paused, his spatula hovering over the griddle, and looked at Tyler with genuine confusion. "I'm sorry, son, could you repeat that? Just tell me how you want your eggs cooked." Tyler grinned at his phone camera, and repeated the request with even more exaggerated slang, drawing out the moment of Frank's bewilderment for maximum comedic effect. Behind Tyler, Mason and Alex were barely containing their laughter, and several other recruits had gathered to watch the performance. Frank's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. For just a moment, something flashed across his weathered features that wasn't confusion or good-natured tolerance. It was the look of someone who understood exactly what was happening, and was choosing how to respond. Then the moment passed, and Frank's professional mask slipped back into place. "Over easy wheat toast and a short stack," Frank said quietly, translating Tyler's performance into actual food. "That'll be ready in 3 minutes. Tyler looked slightly deflated that his elaborate joke hadn't produced a bigger reaction, but he accepted the food when it was ready, and moved on to find a seat. What he'd captured on video, though, was something more complex than simple confusion. Anyone watching closely might have noticed the brief moment when Frank's posture straightened almost imperceptibly, when his eyes sharpened with the kind of awareness that came from years of reading people and situations. But Tyler was too focused on his performance to notice, and his followers were too entertained by the apparent generation gap comedy to look deeper. Sarah Chen, however, had been watching from across the kitchen, and she'd seen that momentary transformation in Frank's demeanor. It lasted only seconds, but it was enough to make her wonder who Frank Martinez really was beneath his quiet exterior. She'd worked with enough veterans to recognize certain subtle signs, the way someone carried themselves, the automatic scanning of exits and entrances, the careful positioning that kept backs protected and hands free. Frank had some of those habits, she realized, though they were so deeply ingrained and naturally expressed that she'd never consciously noticed them before. That afternoon, after the lunch rush had ended, and the kitchen was quiet, except for the dishwashers and prep cooks getting ready for dinner, Sarah found herself lingering near Frank's station as he cleaned his griddles and organized his supplies for the next morning. Frank worked with the same methodical precision he brought to cooking, wiping down surfaces until they gleamed, checking seasoning levels, making notes about inventory needs in handwriting that was surprisingly neat and precise. "Frank," Sarah said casually, not wanting to make her curiosity too obvious, "you've been doing this for a while, haven't you?" Frank looked up from his cleaning and smiled, the kind of genuine expression that made the lines around his eyes deepen with warmth. "Going on 15 years here at Pearl," he said. "Started right after I retired from my last job, military." Sarah asked, though something in Frank's bearing had already suggested the answer. "Navy," Frank confirmed, but he didn't elaborate. There was something in his tone that discouraged further questions, a polite but firm boundary that Sarah recognized from her own experience with veterans who preferred not to discuss their service. Sarah nodded, and let the subject drop, but her curiosity was stronger now than before. 15 years at Pearl Harbor meant Frank had started working in the mess hall around 2009, when he would have been 50. That suggested a full 20 or 30-year military career, before he'd taken the civilian position. The math alone was interesting, but it was Frank's subtle deflection of her question that really caught Sarah's attention. In her experience, most veterans were happy to share at least basic information about their service, especially with other military personnel. Frank's reluctance to elaborate suggested either something painful in his past, or something he'd been trained not to discuss. Over the weekend, while Tyler's latest video gained traction online, and Frank presumably enjoyed 2 days away from the increasingly uncomfortable attention, Sarah found herself thinking about the disconnect between the man she worked with every day, and the figure being portrayed in the viral content. The Frank Martinez she knew was competent, reliable, and quietly skilled. He treated everyone with equal courtesy, never complained about long hours or difficult customers, and had an almost intuitive understanding of kitchen logistics that came from years of experience feeding large groups of people efficiently. The Frank Martinez in Tyler's videos was a doddering old man, confused by modern language, moving slowly through simple tasks, representing everything young people found tedious about older generations. Sarah realized that Tyler wasn't just making fun of Frank's age or job, he was creating a completely false narrative about who Frank was and what he represented. And Frank, with his characteristic dignity and professionalism, was enduring the mockery without defending himself, or even acknowledging that he was aware of it. Monday morning brought a new dynamic to the mess hall that Sarah noticed immediately. Word about Tyler's videos had spread beyond his immediate social media following, and more recruits were coming to Frank's station with phones discreetly recording, hoping to catch their own moments of the grandpa griddle content that had become popular entertainment. Frank's line was longer than usual, not because people particularly wanted his food, but because they wanted their own videos of the old cook who'd become an internet meme. Frank handled the increased attention with his typical professionalism, but Sarah could see the strain it was causing. His movements were slightly more careful, his responses more guarded, and there was a tension in his shoulders that spoke of someone constantly aware of being watched and judged. Several times during the morning rush, Sarah noticed Frank pause between orders, taking a barely perceptible moment to compose himself before greeting the next customer with his standard courtesy. The situation reached a new level of cruelty when Tyler arrived with a larger group of followers, including some recruits from other barracks who'd seen his videos and wanted to witness the Grandpa Griddle show in person. Tyler had clearly planned something special for this performance, because he approached Frank's station with exaggerated deference, speaking in the kind of loud, slow voice typically reserved for elderly people with hearing problems. "Good morning, sir," Tyler announced, projecting his voice across the surrounding area. "I was wondering if you could help a young sailor out with some breakfast wisdom. You've probably been making eggs since before I was born, so I thought maybe you could share some of your ancient cooking secrets with the new generation." The group behind Tyler was barely containing their laughter, phones out and recording, waiting for Frank's response to this obviously mocking request for wisdom. Sarah watched from across the kitchen, her jaw clenched with anger at Tyler's performance and concern for how Frank would handle this latest escalation. Frank looked at Tyler for a long moment, then at the group of young faces behind him, all watching expectantly with their recording devices ready. Something shifted in Frank's expression, a subtle change that Sarah recognized from Friday's incident, but that Tyler was too focused on his performance to notice. "The secret," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume, "is remembering that you're feeding people, not just making food. Every meal matters to someone. Every person in that line is trusting you to fuel their day, their training, their mission. You treated responsibility with respect, and the food takes care of itself." It wasn't the confused rambling response Tyler had been hoping for. Instead it was articulate, thoughtful, and delivered with a quiet dignity that made Tyler's mockery seem petty and small by comparison. For a moment, the assembled group was silent, caught off guard by the sincerity and wisdom in Frank's words. Tyler, sensing that the moment wasn't going according to his script, tried to regain control of the situation. "Wow, that's really deep, Grandpa. Did you learn that philosophy back when you were cooking for dinosaurs?" But Frank had already turned back to his griddle, dismissing Tyler and his followers with the kind of controlled indifference that spoke of someone who dealt with far worse than teenage mockery. He began preparing Tyler's order with his usual efficiency, and the show was effectively over. Sarah had seen enough. As Tyler's group dispersed with their footage, laughing and commenting on Frank's lecture about cooking philosophy, she made a decision that would change everything. She was going to find out who Frank Martinez really was, and she was going to put an end to his humiliation at the hands of recruits who had no idea what they were mocking. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment off base with her laptop open, beginning the research that would uncover a story far more extraordinary than anything Tyler could have imagined. She started with basic personnel records, the kind of information available to supervisors for scheduling and administrative purposes. Frank's file showed his start date at Pearl Harbor, his exemplary performance reviews, his perfect attendance record, and his emergency contact information. But it also showed something else that made Sarah pause. Frank's previous employer was listed simply as U.S. Navy, with dates spanning from 1976 to 2007. 31 years of service, ending at age 52, with what appeared to be early retirement. Sarah stared at those dates, doing the math in her head. Frank would have enlisted in 1976, during the final years of the Vietnam War. He would have served through the Cold War, the Persian Gulf conflict, and into the early years of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. 3 decades of naval service suggested a serious military career, not the simple enlisted service that most people associated with older veterans working civilian jobs on military bases. Curious now, Sarah began searching through public records and military databases, looking for any additional information about Frank Martinez's service record. What she found was frustrating in its incompleteness. Frank appeared in basic personnel databases confirming his years of service and honorable discharge, but the details of his assignments, specialties and achievements were either classified or had been archived beyond easy access. For someone with 3 decades of naval service, Frank's publicly available record was remarkably thin. That absence of information was itself a kind of information, Sarah realized. In her experience, detailed service records were typically available, unless there were specific security reasons for restricting access. Frank hadn't just served in the Navy for 31 years, he'd served in positions or operations that remained classified long after his retirement. The quiet cook who made perfect pancakes and endured mockery from teenagers had a hidden history that someone, somewhere, had decided needed to remain hidden. Sarah's research took on new urgency as she realized she might be dealing with someone whose service record contained sensitive information. She began looking for indirect evidence, searching for news articles, unit histories, and public records that might contain references to Frank's service without explicitly detailing classified operations. It was slow, painstaking work, but Sarah had developed research skills during her own military career, and she was determined to understand who Frank Martinez really was. The breakthrough came when Sarah discovered a digitized collection of old Navy newsletters from the 1980s. The newsletters contained routine updates about personnel transfers, promotions and commendations, the kind of mundane administrative information that had been preserved more for historical completeness than for any ongoing security value. Searching through these archives, Sarah found brief mentions of a petty officer Martinez assigned to various vessels and installations throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. One mention made Sarah's heart rate quicken. In a 1987 newsletter, she found a brief item about commendations awarded to crew members of the USS Constellation for exceptional service during humanitarian operations in the South China Sea. Among the names listed was Petty Officer First Class Frank Martinez, commended for extraordinary courage in selfless service under dangerous conditions. The USS Constellation. Sarah recognized the name from naval history, though she couldn't immediately recall specific details about the ship's service record. She began researching the constellation's operations during the 1980s, looking for information about what kind of humanitarian operations might have required extraordinary courage from crew members. What Sarah discovered made her understand why Frank Martinez's service record might be restricted, and why the quiet cook who endured mockery from recruits might have more important things on his mind than defending himself from teenage jokes. The USS Constellation's operations in the South China Sea during the 1980s had involved refugee rescue missions, pulling desperate people from overcrowded boats fleeing political persecution and economic collapse. These operations were often dangerous, conducted in rough seas under difficult conditions, and frequently involved split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for hundreds of people. But it was what Sarah found next that made her realize she was dealing with something far more significant than routine humanitarian service. Hidden in a declassified military history archive, she discovered a detailed account of a specific incident involving the USS Constellation in 1987, an incident that had resulted in multiple commendations and decorations for crew members who'd participated in an extraordinary rescue operation under combat conditions. According to the archived report, the Constellation had responded to a distress call from a refugee vessel that was under attack by pirates in international waters. The rescue operation had been complicated by rough seas, hostile fire, and the structural failure of the refugee boat, which had begun sinking while still under attack. Crew members had volunteered for an extremely dangerous small boat rescue mission, operating under fire to evacuate over 200 refugees from a sinking vessel, while engaged in combat with attacking pirates. The report specifically mentioned Petty Officer First Class Frank Martinez as one of the volunteers who'd made multiple trips between the sinking refugee boat and the Constellation, personally responsible for evacuating dozens of people under increasingly dangerous conditions. Martinez had continued the rescue operation, even after being wounded by shrapnel from pirate gunfire, and had been the last person to leave the refugee vessel before it sank completely. Sarah sat back in her chair, staring at her laptop screen as the full implications of what she'd discovered began to sink in. Frank Martinez wasn't just a veteran with an unremarkable service record. He was a decorated hero who'd risked his life under combat conditions to save hundreds of refugees. The quiet cook who Tyler Brooks was mocking as Grandpa Griddle had personally pulled drowning people from burning waters while under enemy fire. But Sarah's research had raised as many questions as it had answered. The report she'd found detailed Frank's actions during the 1987 incident, but it was clear that this was just one mission among many during his 31-year career. What other operations had Frank participated in? What other lives had he saved? And why was someone with his record working as a cook in a mess hall, instead of receiving the recognition and respect his service deserved? The answer to that last question would come sooner than Sarah expected, and it would involve someone with the authority to reveal truths that had been hidden for decades. But first, Sarah had to decide what to do with the information she'd uncovered. Tyler Brooks and his followers were turning Frank into internet entertainment, completely unaware that they were mocking someone whose courage and service had saved hundreds of lives. Sarah felt a responsibility to protect Frank from this humiliation, but she also felt a responsibility to respect his privacy and his apparent desire to keep his past hidden. As she closed her laptop and prepared for bed, Sarah made a decision that would change everything for Frank Martinez and the recruits who thought he knew who he was. She would continue her research, and she would find a way to ensure that Frank received the respect he deserved, even if it meant revealing secrets that had been buried for decades. The next morning would bring me developments that would accelerate Sarah's timeline, and force decisions that would expose the extraordinary truth about the man everyone called Grandpa Griddle. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made Hawaii feel like paradise, even at 4:30 in the morning when Frank Martinez unlocked the mess hall doors and stepped into the familiar darkness of his domain. The air conditioning had kept the kitchen cool overnight, but Frank knew that within an hour, the combination of industrial ovens, griddles, and fryers would transform the space into a controlled inferno that demanded respect and careful navigation. Frank moved through his opening routine with practiced efficiency, turning on equipment in a specific sequence that maximized energy efficiency and minimized startup time. Coffee brewers first, their heating elements needing time to reach optimal temperature. Then the main griddle, its massive surface requiring 15 minutes to achieve the even heat distribution that made perfect pancakes possible. Fryers came next, oil temperatures monitored with the precision of a chemist. Finally, the smaller equipment: toasters, steamers, warming trays, each device playing its role in the morning symphony of breakfast service. As Frank worked, his mind wandered to the previous day's encounter with Tyler Brooks and his growing entourage of amateur filmmakers. Frank had dealt with difficult customers throughout his 15 years at Pearl Harbor, from hungover sailors demanding impossible breakfast combinations to visiting dignitaries with elaborate dietary restrictions. But Tyler's mockery represented something different, something that touched on aspects of Frank's life he'd worked hard to leave behind. The truth was, Frank Martinez had chosen his post-military career deliberately. After 31 years of high-stakes operations, classified missions, and life-or-death decisions that could affect hundreds of people, the simple act of cooking breakfast for hungry sailors offered a kind of peace he'd never experienced during his active duty years. Every morning, he could focus on straightforward tasks with predictable outcomes. Eggs cooked at specific temperatures for specific times. Pancakes that rose and browned according to immutable laws of chemistry and physics. Coffee that satisfied customers based on measurable ratios of grounds to water brewing time and serving temperature. It was honest work that hurt no one, and helped everyone who walked through his line. Frank took genuine pride in sending people into their day properly fueled, knowing that his perfectly prepared meals would give sailors the energy they needed for training, maintenance, operations, and all the countless tasks that kept a naval base functioning. There was dignity in that service, even if people like Tyler Brooks couldn't see it. But Frank also understood that his current peaceful existence depended on maintaining the careful separation he'd built between his past and present lives. The Frank Martinez who made pancakes at Pearl Harbor was a different person from Petty Officer First Class Martinez, who'd pulled drowning refugees from burning waters under enemy fire. That earlier version of himself had been capable of extraordinary things under impossible circumstances, but he'd also carried the weight of decisions and experiences that had nearly broken him. The transition from military to civilian life had been harder than Frank had anticipated when he'd submitted his retirement papers in 2007. 31 years of naval service had given him skills, experiences, and perspectives that didn't translate easily to civilian employment. He tried various jobs during his first 2 years of retirement: security work that reminded him too much of his military assignments, construction projects that felt meaningless after missions that had saved lives, office work that left him feeling trapped and purposeless. The position at Pearl Harbor had been a compromise between his need for meaningful work and his desire for simplicity. Cooking for military personnel allowed him to continue serving without the complications of classified operations or command responsibilities. He could use his understanding of military culture and logistics while avoiding the triggers that reminded him of more difficult chapters in his service record. Frank had hoped that his quiet competence would earn him the kind of respectful invisibility that many civilian employees enjoyed on military bases. For 14.5 years, that strategy had worked perfectly. He'd been known as a reliable, skilled cook who did his job well and caused no problems for anyone. Supervisors appreciated his punctuality and professionalism. Customers appreciated his food quality and efficient service. Colleagues appreciated his willingness to help during busy periods, and his lack of drama or complaints. Tyler Brooks had disrupted that carefully maintained equilibrium by turning Frank into a character in an ongoing internet performance. The videos weren't just embarrassing, they were dangerous to the psychological balance Frank had spent years achieving. Every time Tyler filmed him, Frank felt the old hypervigilance returning, the constant awareness of being watched and evaluated that had been essential during his military career, but was exhausting in civilian life. Frank finished his morning preparations and glanced at the clock. 5:15. The breakfast rush would begin in 45 minutes, and Tyler would likely arrive with his usual group of followers, phones ready to capture more content for their entertainment. Frank took a deep breath and made a decision that would have significant consequences for everyone involved. He would not continue to be a passive victim of Tyler's mockery. Across the base in the administrative offices that housed personnel records and operational planning, Sarah Chen was arriving early for her own version of morning preparation. She'd spent the previous evening researching Frank Martinez's background, and what she'd discovered had kept her awake far longer than usual. The quiet cook who endured daily humiliation from teenage recruits had a service record that included classified operations and life-saving heroics under combat conditions. Sarah had printed copies of the documents she'd found, carefully organizing them in a folder that she kept locked in her desk drawer. The information raised ethical questions about privacy and confidentiality that Sarah was still working through. Frank had clearly chosen not to discuss his military background, and Sarah respected his right to keep his past private. But Tyler's videos were becoming increasingly popular, spreading Frank's humiliation beyond the confines of Pearl Harbor to a growing online audience that saw him as nothing more than entertainment. The balance between respecting Frank's privacy and protecting him from ongoing mockery was delicate, and Sarah hadn't yet decided how to proceed. She'd considered approaching Frank directly, letting him know that she was aware of his background, and asking how he wanted to handle Tyler's harassment. But something in Frank's demeanor suggested that he preferred to deal with problems on his own terms, and Sarah didn't want to violate that independence unless absolutely necessary. Instead, Sarah had decided to document Tyler's behavior more carefully, building a case for intervention based on harassment and disruption of mess hall operations rather than on Frank's classified background. If Tyler's videos continued to escalate, Sarah would have grounds to involve base security or Tyler's commanding officers without revealing sensitive information about Frank's service record. Sarah unlocked her office and settled at her desk with coffee and the morning reports that detailed the previous day's operations, supply usage and personnel issues. Everything was routine except for one note from the evening supervisor mentioning increased foot traffic at Frank's breakfast station, with several recruits appearing to film their interactions with the cook. The supervisor hadn't intervened, because the behavior wasn't explicitly prohibited, but the note suggested growing awareness among the mess hall staff that something unusual was happening around Frank's station. At 5:30, Sarah walked through the mess hall to check on morning preparations. The kitchen was humming with activity as the breakfast crew prepared for the morning rush. Frank was at his station methodically setting up his griddle and organizing his ingredients with the precision she'd come to associate with his work. But there was something different about his posture this morning, a subtle tension that suggested he was preparing for more than just another breakfast shift. "Morning, Frank," Sarah said, stopping at his station to review his prep work. "Everything looking good for the rush?" Frank looked up and nodded, but Sarah noticed that his usual morning smile seemed forced. "All set, Chief. Got plenty of everything, and the equipment's running smooth." Sarah studied Frank's face, noting the lines of fatigue around his eyes and the careful way he held his shoulders. The man was clearly stressed, and Sarah suspected that Tyler's harassment was taking a greater toll than Frank was willing to admit. "Frank," Sarah said carefully, "if anyone's giving you trouble, you know you can come to me, right? Part of my job is making sure this kitchen runs smoothly, and that includes making sure the staff can work without harassment." For a moment something flickered across Frank's expression, a brief glimpse of the man behind the careful mask of professional courtesy. Then he nodded and returned to his prep work. "I appreciate that, Chief. Really, but I can handle whatever comes up." Sarah wanted to press further, to let Frank know that she understood more about his background than he might expect, but something in his tone discouraged additional questions. Instead she nodded, and continued her morning rounds, making mental notes about the dynamics she was observing, and the decisions she might need to make in the coming days. At 6 o'clock, the mess hall doors opened for the breakfast rush, and within minutes, the kitchen was operating at full capacity. Frank's station became the controlled chaos Sarah had observed hundreds of times before, orders coming in faster than seemed possible to fulfill, Frank managing multiple cooking surfaces simultaneously, finished plates moving out to hungry customers with mechanical precision. For the first 20 minutes, everything proceeded normally. Frank served the early shift workers who needed to grab quick breakfasts before reporting to duty, the fitness enthusiasts who wanted protein-heavy meals before morning workouts, and the night shift personnel who were ending their day with what amounted to dinner, served on breakfast plates. Then Tyler Brooks arrived with a larger group than usual. Sarah counted at least 8 recruits following Tyler toward Frank's station, several of them already holding phones in positions that suggested planned recording. Tyler himself was carrying a small tripod, and what appeared to be a more sophisticated camera than the simple phone videos he'd been making previously. Sarah positioned herself where she could observe the interaction while continuing her normal supervisory duties. She had a clear view of Frank's station and could hear most of the conversation between Frank and the recruits. What she witnessed over the next 15 minutes would provide the evidence she needed to take action, but it would also reveal aspects of Frank Martinez's character that went far beyond anything in his classified service record. Tyler approached Frank's station with theatrical confidence, setting up his camera equipment while explaining his plans to his followers in a voice loud enough to be heard throughout the surrounding area. "Alright guys, this is going to be epic. I'm thinking we do a whole cooking with Grandpa segment. Get him to explain his ancient techniques, maybe share some wisdom from back when he was learning to cook over open fires or whatever. This is going to be pure gold for the channel." Frank continued working, acknowledging Tyler's order with professional courtesy, while ignoring the commentary and camera setup. But Sarah could see the tension building in Frank's shoulders, the careful way he was controlling his movements, to avoid giving Tyler's audience any ammunition for mockery. Tyler ordered an elaborate breakfast combination that required Frank to prepare multiple items simultaneously: scrambled eggs with specific vegetables, pancakes with particular toppings, bacon cooked to a precise level of crispness, and coffee prepared with modifications that made the request unnecessarily complicated. As Frank worked, Tyler maintained a running commentary for his camera, narrating Frank's movements with the kind of condescending amusement that made Sarah's jaw clench with anger. "Look at that concentration, folks. Grandpa's really focusing on those eggs like they're some kind of nuclear codes. I bet he learned that level of precision back when dinosaurs ruled the earth, and cooking fires were lit with actual flint and steel." The recruits behind Tyler were laughing, and adding their own commentary, creating a carnival atmosphere around Frank's station that was disrupting the normal flow of breakfast service. Other customers were having trouble getting through the line because Tyler's group was blocking access and creating delays with their filming requirements. Frank completed Tyler's order with his usual efficiency, but instead of simply handing over the food and moving on to the next customer, he did something that surprised everyone watching. He looked directly into Tyler's camera and spoke in a clear, calm voice that carried throughout the mess hall. "Son, I've been watching you make these videos for a few weeks now, and I think it's time we had a conversation about what you're really doing here." Tyler's eyes widened with excitement. This was the kind of response he'd been hoping for, the moment when Grandpa Griddle would finally react to his mockery and provide even better content for his channel. "Oh, this is great," Tyler said, adjusting his camera angle to capture Frank's face more clearly. "The old-timer wants to have a heart-to-heart. This is going to be amazing content." But Frank wasn't playing the role Tyler expected. Instead of appearing confused or defensive, Frank stood straight and looked Tyler in the eye, with the kind of steady gaze that Sarah recognized from her own military training. There was authority in Frank's posture now, the bearing of someone accustomed to command and respect. "You think I'm just some old man who doesn't understand your generation," Frank said, his voice remaining calm but carrying an edge of steel that made several of the laughing recruits fall silent. "You think making jokes about my age and my job makes you clever or entertaining, but what you don't understand is that every person in this line, including you, is depending on me to do my job right." Tyler tried to interrupt with another joke, but Frank continued speaking with the kind of controlled intensity that demanded attention. "I've been feeding people for longer than you've been alive, and I've learned something you might want to consider. The quality of a person isn't measured by their age or their job title, it's measured by how they treat other people, especially people who can't fight back." The mess hall had grown quieter as Frank spoke, with conversations dying down, and customers pausing to listen to the exchange. Sarah could see that other kitchen staff had stopped their work to watch, and even Tyler's followers were looking less certain about the entertainment value of their mockery. Frank handed Tyler his breakfast tray, and leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice, so that only Tyler and his immediate group could hear what came next. I don't know what kind of person you're trying to be, son, but I hope you figure out that hurting people for entertainment isn't going to get you where you want to go in life. And I hope you figure it out before you run into someone who's not as patient as I am. Tyler stood frozen for a moment, holding his breakfast tray, while trying to process what had just happened. Frank's response wasn't the confused rambling he'd expected. It was articulate, dignified, and delivered with an authority that suggested depth Tyler hadn't suspected existed beneath the quiet cook's exterior. The moment stretched awkwardly, as Tyler tried to think of a comeback that would restore his control over the situation. But Frank had already turned to the next customer in line, dismissing Tyler and his camera, with the kind of professional indifference that made any continued confrontation seem petty and childish. Sarah watched Tyler retreat to a table with his followers, all of them looking less confident than they had when they'd arrived. The dynamic had shifted in ways that Tyler clearly hadn't anticipated, and Sarah could see him reviewing the footage on his camera, trying to determine whether Frank's response had helped or hurt his content creation goals. But Frank's public response to Tyler's harassment was only the beginning of changes that would transform the situation in ways no one could have predicted. Within hours, Tyler's video of Frank's dignified confrontation would be posted online, but the audience reaction would be very different from what Tyler expected. And within days, Frank's carefully maintained separation between his past and present would be shattered by the arrival of someone who knew exactly who Frank Martinez really was, and what he had accomplished during his 31 years of naval service. The morning rush continued with Frank returning to his normal routine, but Sarah could see that something fundamental had changed. Frank's public stand against Tyler's mockery had revealed aspects of his character that went beyond cooking skills and work ethic. The quiet man who had endured weeks of harassment had shown that his patience had limits, and that beneath his humble exterior was someone accustomed to command and respect. As the breakfast crowd thinned, and Frank began cleaning his station for the lunch preparation, Sarah made her decision about how to proceed with the information she'd discovered about his background. Frank had demonstrated that he was capable of defending himself when necessary, but he was still vulnerable to harassment that could escalate beyond simple mockery. Sarah would continue her research, and be prepared to intervene if Tyler's behavior crossed lines that threatened Frank's safety, or the mess hall's operations. What Sarah didn't know was that her research had already set in motion a chain of events that would bring Frank's past into collision with his present in ways that would change everything for everyone involved. The documents she'd accessed had triggered automatic notifications in systems designed to monitor queries about classified personnel, and those notifications had reached people who remembered Petty Officer First Class Frank Martinez, and the extraordinary courage he demonstrated during operations that remained sensitive decades after they'd occurred. By the end of the week, Frank's quiet life at Pearl Harbor would be transformed. Tyler Brooks would understand the true cost of his mockery, and everyone who thought they knew the old cook would discover that some heroes choose their battles carefully, but they never stop being heroes. The rest of Tuesday passed quietly, with Tyler's group notably absent from the lunch rush, and Frank returning to his normal routine of efficient professional service. But the morning's confrontation had created ripples that were spreading beyond the confines of the Pearl Harbor mess hall, ripples that would soon become waves capable of washing away the careful barriers Frank had built between his past and present lives. Sarah spent her afternoon reviewing Tyler's social media activity, documenting the pattern of harassment that had led to Frank's public response. What she found online made her realize that the situation was more serious than she'd initially understood. Tyler's grandpa griddle videos had gained significant traction among military social media communities, with hundreds of comments from young service members who found entertainment in mocking older veterans working civilian jobs on military bases. The comment threads revealed a disturbing pattern of ageism and disrespect that went far beyond simple generational humor. Many commenters were making assumptions about Frank's competence, intelligence, and value based solely on his age and job, creating a narrative that reduced a complex human being to a stereotype ripe for ridicule. But Tyler's latest video, featuring Frank's dignified response to the harassment, was generating a different kind of reaction. While some viewers continued to support Tyler's mockery, a growing number of commenters were expressing discomfort with the dynamic they were witnessing. Several military veterans had posted comments defending Frank and criticizing Tyler's behavior, noting that making fun of older service members reflected poorly on military values and traditions. Sarah realized that Tyler's videos had created a public relations problem that extended beyond the Pearl Harbor mess hall. The content was making the Navy look bad by showcasing young sailors disrespecting older veterans, and it was creating a hostile work environment that could have legal and administrative consequences if left unchecked. As Sarah prepared to leave work that afternoon, she made a decision that would accelerate the timeline for resolving the situation. She would request a meeting with the base's senior leadership to discuss Tyler's behavior and recommend intervention before the problem escalated further. She wouldn't reveal Frank's classified background unless absolutely necessary, but she would make it clear that Tyler's harassment was creating problems that required administrative action. What Sarah didn't know was that her research into Frank's service record had already triggered interest from people with the authority to reveal truths that had been classified for decades. By Wednesday morning, phone calls were being made, records were being reviewed, and decisions were being reached that would transform Frank Martinez from an anonymous cook into a figure whose story would inspire and humble everyone who heard it. The stage was set for revelations that would expose the true cost of Tyler's mockery and demonstrate that some people's quiet dignity masks extraordinary courage and sacrifice that deserve respect, not ridicule. Frank Martinez was about to discover that some secrets are too important to remain hidden, and Tyler Brooks was about to learn that actions have consequences that extend far beyond social media entertainment. Wednesday would bring changes that would forever alter dynamics at Pearl Harbor's Building 47 mess hall, and everyone involved would discover that heroes come in unexpected forms, often choosing service over recognition and humility over self-promotion. The old cook's secret was about to become a story that would challenge assumptions, inspire respect, and prove that extraordinary people often hide in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to remind the world what true courage looks like. Wednesday morning brought an unusual stillness to the Pearl Harbor mess hall that Frank Martinez noticed immediately as he began his pre-dawn preparations. The familiar rhythm of industrial kitchen sounds seemed muted somehow, as if the building itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something significant. Frank attributed the feeling to his own heightened awareness following Tuesday's confrontation with Tyler Brooks, but there was something else in the air that he couldn't quite identify. The overnight cleaning crew had left everything spotless as usual, but Frank noticed small details that suggested unusual activity in the administrative areas of the building. Extra security checks during the night shift, according to the logbook he reviewed each morning. Additional personnel badges logged through the main entrance after normal business hours. Nothing alarming, but enough to suggest that people in positions of authority were paying closer attention to Building 47 than they typically did. Frank moved through his morning routine with mechanical precision, but his mind was processing the implications of his public response to Tyler's harassment. For 15 years, he'd maintained careful control over his interactions with customers and colleagues, never allowing personal frustration or past experiences to influence his professional demeanor. Tuesday morning had been different. Something in Tyler's exhalating mockery had pushed Frank past his carefully maintained boundaries, forcing him to respond in ways that revealed more about his character than he'd intended. The response had felt necessary and appropriate in the moment, but Frank was experienced enough to understand that actions had consequences, especially when those actions were recorded and broadcast to online audiences. Tyler's camera had captured Frank's dignified confrontation, and that footage was now part of a digital record that could be analyzed, shared and potentially traced back to people who might recognize more about Frank Martinez than his current role as a mess hall cook. Frank had spent decades learning to manage risk and anticipate consequences, skills that had kept him alive during dangerous operations and helped him transition successfully to civilian life. Those same skills were now telling him that Tuesday's confrontation, however justified, had created vulnerabilities that he would need to address carefully. The coffee brewing system reached optimal temperature, and Frank began preparing the massive quantities of coffee that would fuel the morning shift at Pearl Harbor. The routine task allowed his mind to focus on practical considerations while processing the emotional complexity of his situation. He'd built his post-military life around the principle of quiet service, contributing meaningfully without drawing attention to himself or his past. Tyler's videos had already disrupted that careful balance, and Frank's public response had potentially accelerated a process he'd hoped to avoid. As Frank worked, he found himself thinking about the young recruits who'd been following Tyler's lead in mocking him. Most of them were barely out of high school, thrust into military life with incomplete understanding of the traditions, values and sacrifices that defined naval service. They saw Frank as an old man doing a simple job, unaware that his presence at Pearl Harbor represented choices about service, dignity and purpose that they weren't yet mature enough to recognize or appreciate. Frank didn't blame them for their ignorance. He'd been young once himself, confident in his assumptions about the world and the people around him. Military service had a way of teaching humility through experience, showing young people that their initial judgments were often incomplete or entirely wrong. Tyler and his followers would eventually learn those lessons, though Frank hoped they would learn them in less painful ways than some of the education he'd received during his own career. The morning prep work continued with Frank checking inventory, organizing ingredients, and testing equipment functionality. Everything was operating normally, but Frank's heightened awareness was picking up subtle changes in the building's atmosphere. Conversations among the night shift personnel as they prepared to leave seemed more hushed than usual. The security guards were making additional rounds, their presence more visible than typical. Even the cleaning crew had worked with unusual thoroughness, paying attention to areas that didn't normally receive such detailed attention. Frank recognized the signs of increased administrative scrutiny, the subtle changes that occurred when people in positions of authority were paying closer attention to specific locations or personnel. He'd seen it many times during his military career, the gradual tightening of security and oversight that preceded official investigations or high-level visits. The question was whether the increased attention was related to Tyler's harassment and Frank's response, or whether other factors were driving the changes he was observing. At 5:30 Sarah Chen arrived for her morning rounds, but her demeanor was different from her usual professional efficiency. She moved through the kitchen with the careful attention of someone conducting an unofficial inspection, noting details about staff performance, equipment functionality, and overall operations that went beyond her normal supervisory responsibilities. When Sarah reached Frank's station, she paused longer than usual, reviewing his prep work with unusual thoroughness. Frank sensed that she was looking for something specific, though he couldn't determine what might be driving her heightened attention. "Morning, Frank," Sarah said, her tone carrying undertones of concern that she was trying to keep professional. "How are things going after yesterday?" Frank met her gaze steadily, recognizing that Sarah's question was about more than simple follow-up on Tyler's harassment. There was something in her expression that suggested she knew more about the situation than she was revealing, and Frank's instincts were telling him that Sarah Chen was someone who might become either an ally or a complication, depending on how he handled their interactions. "Everything's running smoothly, Chief," Frank replied, maintaining his standard professional courtesy, while watching Sarah's face for additional clues about her concerns. "No problems with equipment or supplies, and I'm ready for the morning rush." Sarah nodded, But Frank could see that she was weighing her words carefully before responding. "Frank, I want you to know that if anyone gives you trouble, you should report it immediately. There are protocols for dealing with harassment, and you don't have to handle problems on your own." The offer was genuine, and Frank appreciated Sarah's concern, but he also recognized the complexity of his situation. Reporting Tyler's harassment through official channels would require documentation, investigation, and potentially testimony that could expose aspects of Frank's background he preferred to keep private. The cure might be worse than the disease, especially if administrative action led to deeper inquiries about his service record or current employment. "I appreciate that, Chief," Frank said carefully. "Yesterday went fine, and I think the situation is resolved. But I'll let you know if anything else comes up." Sarah studied Frank's face, and he could see her trying to balance respect for his privacy with her supervisory responsibilities. There was something in her expression that suggested she was dealing with information or pressures that she couldn't discuss openly, and Frank's experience was telling him that Sarah Chen might be caught between competing loyalties or obligations. "All right," Sarah said finally. "But Frank, if things change, if the situation escalates in any way, I need to know immediately. There are people paying attention to what happens in this mess hall, and I want to make sure everyone is protected." The warning was subtle but clear, and Frank understood that Sarah was trying to tell him something important without violating confidentiality or protocol. People in positions of authority were aware of the situation, and those people had expectations about how problems would be handled. Frank nodded his acknowledgement, and returned to his prep work, but his mind was now processing the implications of Sarah's message. As the breakfast rush began, Frank noticed that Tyler Brooks was notably absent from his usual arrival time. The recruits from Delta 7 barracks appeared for breakfast, but they approached Frank's station with less confidence than they'd shown previously. Several of them made eye contact, and offered polite greetings that contrasted sharply with their previous indifference or mockery. Mason Wright, one of Tyler's usual followers, approached Frank's station with obvious nervousness, ordering a simple breakfast without the elaborate performance that had characterized recent visits. As Frank prepared the food, Mason cleared his throat and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Martinez, I wanted to say that I'm sorry about the videos and stuff. Tyler said it was just harmless fun, but after yesterday, I realized it probably wasn't fun for you." Frank looked up from the griddle, and met Mason's eyes, seeing genuine remorse in the young recruit's expression. The apology was awkward and incomplete, but it represented recognition that actions had consequences, and that Frank deserved better treatment than he'd been receiving. "I appreciate that, son," Frank said quietly, handing Mason his breakfast tray. "We all make mistakes when we're learning. The important thing is recognizing them and doing better next time." Mason nodded gratefully, and moved away from the station, but Frank could see that other recruits had been watching the interaction. Word was spreading through Tyler's group that the dynamic had changed, and that continuing the mockery might not be as consequence-free as they'd assumed. The morning continued with Frank serving customers efficiently while monitoring the subtle changes in atmosphere and behavior that suggested larger forces were in motion. The breakfast crowd seemed more respectful than usual, with several regular customers making positive comments about the food quality, and thanking Frank for his service with unusual sincerity. Around 8:30, as the morning rush was winding down, Frank noticed a commotion near the mess hall entrance that drew his attention away from his cleaning routine. A small group of people in dress uniforms had entered the building, moving with the purposeful authority that Frank recognized from decades of military experience. The uniforms displayed senior rank insignia, and their presence was causing noticeable changes in behavior among the mess hall staff and customers. Sarah Chen appeared at Frank's station with unusual speed, her expression combining professional efficiency with barely controlled anxiety. "Frank, I need you to take a break from your station. Can you cover for him for a few minutes?" she asked, one of the other cooks, her voice carrying the kind of urgency that brooked no questions or delays. Frank wiped his hands on his apron, and followed Sarah toward the administrative area of the building, his mind processing the possible reasons for the summons. The presence of senior officers suggested official business, and Frank's experience was telling him that this wasn't routine administrative review or casual inspection. Something significant was happening, and Frank was apparently central to whatever was unfolding. Sarah led Frank through corridors he rarely visited, past offices and conference rooms that housed the administrative functions of the mess hall operations. The hallways were busier than usual, with personnel moving with the kind of focused activity that accompanied high-level visits or important meetings. They stopped outside a conference room where Frank could see several officers through the partially open door. The uniforms included navy dress blues with insignia, indicating flag rank, the kind of senior leadership that Frank hadn't been in the presence of since his own military service. Sarah knocked and waited for permission to enter, her posture reflecting the nervous energy of someone dealing with situations beyond their normal experience. "Send him in," came a voice from inside the conference room, a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Sarah opened the door and gestured for Frank to enter, but she remained outside as the door closed behind him. Frank found himself standing in a conference room facing 3 senior officers, 2 of whom he didn't recognize. The third officer, however, made Frank's heart skip several beats as recognition hit him like a physical blow. Admiral Robert Hayes stood at the head of the conference table, his dress blue uniform displaying ribbons and decorations that told the story of a distinguished naval career spanning multiple decades and conflicts. Frank hadn't seen Robert Hayes in over 15 years, not since their final meeting during Frank's retirement processing in 2007. Hayes had been a captain then, commanding officer of a vessel that Frank preferred not to remember in too much detail. Hayes was older now, his hair completely gray, and his face marked by the lines that came with years of command responsibility and difficult decisions. But his eyes were the same, sharp and intelligent, missing nothing, and forgetting even less. Those eyes were now focused on Frank with an expression that combined surprise, recognition, and something that might have been relief. "Petty Officer Martinez," Hayes said, his voice carrying across nearly 2 decades as if no time had passed at all. "Or should I say, Senior Chief Martinez, given your final rank before retirement." Frank straightened automatically, his body responding to command presence and formal address with muscle memory that overrode 15 years of civilian life. "Admiral Hayes, sir," he replied, his voice steady despite the emotional turbulence that Hayes's presence was causing. Hayes gestured toward the chair at the conference table, and Frank sat with the kind of precise movements that revealed his military background to anyone trained to recognize such details. The other 2 officers introduced themselves as Captain Williams from Pearl Harbor's command staff and Commander Johnson from Naval Personnel Investigations, but Frank's attention remained focused on Hayes and the implications of his presence. "Frank," Hayes said, dropping the formal military address and speaking in a tone that acknowledged their shared history, "we need to talk about what's been happening in the mess hall, and we need to talk about some things that happened a long time ago." Frank felt the careful walls he'd built between his past and present beginning to crumble, knowing that the conversation ahead would force him to confront aspects of his service record that he'd hoped to leave buried. But looking at Robert Hayes across the conference table, Frank also felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the recognition of someone who understood exactly who he was and what he had accomplished during the most difficult chapters of his military career. The meeting that followed would change everything for Frank Martinez, Tyler Brooks and everyone else who thought they understood the quiet cook who made perfect pancakes and endured mockery with dignified patience. Admiral Hayes had come to Pearl Harbor with specific knowledge about Frank's background and specific intentions about how that background should be acknowledged and respected. Frank's carefully maintained anonymity was about to end, but in ways that would honor his service rather than exploit his privacy. The old cook's secret was about to become a story of heroism, sacrifice, and the quiet dignity of people who choose service over recognition, humility over self-promotion. Tyler Brooks was about to discover that some jokes aren't funny when you understand the full context, and that some people's patience has limits that are enforced by authorities far more powerful than social media followers. The reckoning that had been building since Tyler's first video was about to arrive with the full weight of military justice and institutional memory behind it. Frank Martinez was about to learn that some secrets are too important to remain hidden, and that respect once earned through extraordinary service regardless of how carefully it's been buried beneath humble work and quiet dignity. Admiral Hayes opened the folder on the conference table, revealing documents that Frank recognized despite the years that had passed since he'd last seen them. His service record, commendation letters, and operational reports that detailed missions Frank had hoped never to discuss again. Frank Hayes said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and personal knowledge, "It's time to tell the truth about who you really are, and what you've done for this country. And it's time to make sure that everyone who should know these things gets the full story." The conversation that followed would transform Frank's life at Pearl Harbor, and create ripple effects that would reach far beyond the confines of Building 47 Mess Hall. The old cook's secret was about to become a testament to the extraordinary courage that ordinary-looking people carry within themselves, waiting for the right moment to remind the world what true heroism looks like. The silence in the conference room stretched for what felt like an eternity, as Frank Martinez sat across from Admiral Robert Hayes, both men processing the weight of a shared history that had remained buried for 17 years. The document spread across the table told a story that Frank had never expected to discuss again, filled with details of operations that had been classified at the highest levels, and heroism that had been deliberately obscured for reasons of national security and operational necessity. Admiral Hayes reached for a specific file, one that Frank recognized immediately by its distinctive red classification markings. The sight of that folder brought back memories that Frank had worked hard to compartmentalize, images of burning ships, drowning people, and split-second decisions that had meant the difference between life and death for hundreds of refugees fleeing political persecution in the South China Sea. "Operation Beacon Light," Hayes said quietly, opening the file to reveal photographs, operational reports, and commendation recommendations that painted the detailed picture of events that had occurred in international waters during the spring of 1987. "You remember it, don't you, Frank?" Frank nodded, his throat suddenly dry as he looked at images of the USS Constellation and the refugee vessels they had encountered during what was supposed to be a routine patrol mission. The photographs showed overcrowded boats filled with desperate people, rough seas that made any rescue operation dangerous, and the aftermath of pirate attacks that had left multiple vessels damaged and sinking. "I remember all of it, sir," Frank said, his voice carrying the weight of experiences that had shaped him in ways that were still visible decades later. "Every face, every decision, every person we pulled out of the water." Hayes turned pages in the file, revealing operational reports written in the immediate aftermath of the rescue mission. The language was clinical and precise, describing tactical decisions and casualty figures with the detached professionalism required by military documentation. But between the lines, Frank could see the story of desperate courage under impossible circumstances, of sailors who had volunteered for missions that exceeded all reasonable expectations of survival. "According to these reports," Hayes continued, "you made 7 separate trips between the Constellation and sinking refugee vessels under active hostile fire. You personally evacuated 43 people, including 12 children and 6 wounded adults who required medical assistance during transport. You continued the rescue operation after sustaining shrapnel wounds that should have removed you from active duty." Frank closed his eyes briefly, remembering the weight of unconscious children in it. The slick deck of small boats taking on water faster than pumps could remove it. The sound of automatic weapons fire from pirate vessels that were trying to prevent the rescue operation from succeeding. Those memories had haunted his dreams for years after the mission, contributing to the psychological injuries that had been as significant as the physical wounds he'd received. "You were recommended for the Medal of Honor," Hayes said, his voice carrying notes of pride and regret that Frank understood immediately. "The recommendation went all the way up the chain of command, with support from every officer who witnessed your actions during the operation." Frank opened his eyes and met Hayes' gaze. "But the operation was classified, and awarding the Medal of Honor would have required public recognition that could have compromised ongoing." Hayes nodded. "The decision was made at the highest levels to classify your actions under national security provisions. You received the Navy Cross in a closed ceremony, with the understanding that the full extent of your heroism would remain classified indefinitely. It was a decision that many of us disagreed with, but orders are orders." The Navy Cross had been a significant honor, but Frank understood why the decision had been made to withhold the higher recognition. Operation Beacon Light had been part of a larger intelligence effort to monitor refugee movements and identify potential security threats in the South China Sea. Public recognition of the rescue mission would have revealed American naval presence in areas where the government preferred to maintain operational secrecy. Captain Williams, who had been listening quietly to the exchange between Frank and Hayes, spoke for the first time since the meeting had begun. Martinez, what Admiral Hayes is telling us suggests that you are one of the most decorated veterans currently working on this base, and possibly one of the most decorated veterans working in any civilian capacity in the Pacific Fleet. Frank felt uncomfortable with the praise, just as he had felt uncomfortable with recognition throughout his military career. I did my job, sir. Same as thousands of other sailors who served during those years. The fact that my job involved pulling people out of the water doesn't make me special. Commander Johnson, the personnel investigations officer, opened his own folder and began reading from Tyler Brooks's social media activity. Mr. Martinez, are you aware that videos mocking your work in the mess hall have been viewed over 50,000 times across multiple platforms? That these videos have generated hundreds of comments ridiculing your age, your job, and your perceived competence. Frank had suspected that Tyler's videos were reaching audiences beyond Pearl Harbor, but the numbers Commander Johnson cited were higher than he had imagined. 50,000 views represented a significant online presence, and the kind of viral attention that could have consequences far beyond the embarrassment of being made into internet entertainment. I was aware that the recruit was making videos, Frank said carefully. I wasn't aware of the specific reach or impact of his content. Admiral Hayes closed the Operation Beacon Light file and looked directly at Frank with an expression that combined authority with personal affection. Frank, I've been following your post-military career since your retirement in 2007. I know you chose to work at Pearl Harbor because you wanted to continue serving without the complications of classified operations or command responsibilities. I respect that choice, and I respect your right to privacy about your service record. Frank waited, sensing that Hayes was building toward a decision that would affect his future at Pearl Harbor. But Hayes continued, I cannot allow one of the most courageous sailors I've ever served with to be subjected to public humiliation by recruits who have no understanding of what military service really means. The situation has reached a point where administrative action is necessary, not just to protect you, but to protect the integrity of military values and traditions. Commander Johnson pulled out printed copies of Tyler's videos and social media posts, spreading them across the conference table so that everyone could see the scope of the mockery that had been directed at Frank. The images showed Tyler's exaggerated expressions of amusement, the comments from followers who joined in ridiculing Frank's age and appearance, and the gradual escalation that had led to increasingly cruel and personal attacks. This isn't just harassment of an individual employee, Johnson said. This is a systematic campaign of disrespect directed at a veteran whose service record includes extraordinary heroism under combat conditions. It represents exactly the kind of behavior that undermines military discipline and values. Captain Williams nodded in agreement. We've reviewed Mr. Brooks's service record, and this pattern of behavior is consistent with other disciplinary issues that suggest problems with respect for authority and understanding of military traditions. This situation provides an opportunity to address those problems before they escalate further. Frank felt conflicted about the direction the conversation was taking. Part of him appreciated the support and recognition from officers who understood his background, but another part of him worried about the consequences for Tyler Brooks, who was young and foolish rather than genuinely malicious. Admiral Frank said carefully, I appreciate your concern, and I understand the importance of maintaining discipline and respect within the military community. But Tyler Brooks is 19 years old, and I think his behavior comes from ignorance rather than malice. If there's a way to address the situation that involves education rather than punishment, I would prefer that approach. Hayes smiled, and Frank recognized the expression from their years of service together. It was the look Hayes wore when he was proud of decisions that reflected military values and personal character. Frank, that response is exactly what I would have expected from you. It's the same compassion and wisdom you showed during Operation Beacon Light, when you insisted on staying in the water to help wounded pirates even after they had been shooting at you. The memory Hayes referenced was one that Frank had tried to forget, involving enemy combatants who had been injured during the firefight that preceded the refugee rescue. Military protocols require treating wounded enemies with medical care and basic human dignity, but Frank had gone beyond protocol requirements to ensure that injured pirates received the same level of attention as the refugees they had been attacking. However, Hayes continued, this situation requires a response that serves multiple purposes. We need to protect you from ongoing harassment. We need to educate recruit Brooks and his followers about the consequences of their behavior, and we need to send a clear message to the Pearl Harbor community about respect for veterans and military service. Admiral Hayes stood and walked to the conference room window, looking out at the Pearl Harbor, where ships and sailors continued the daily work of naval operations. Frank could see him weighing decisions that would affect multiple people, and potentially set precedents for how similar situations would be handled in the future. Here's what's going to happen, Hayes said, turning back to face the conference table. First, recruit Brooks and his followers will be brought in for formal counseling about respect for veterans and appropriate use of social media. They will be required to remove all existing content that mocks or ridicules you, and they will be monitored to ensure that no similar content is posted in the future. Commander Johnson made notes as Hayes outlined the administrative response, and Frank could see that the decisions had been carefully considered to balance education with accountability. Second, Hayes continued, we're going to arrange for you to speak to recruit training classes about military service and the importance of respecting veterans. Your service record will be declassified to the extent necessary to provide context for your heroism during Operation Beacon Light and other classified missions. Frank felt a mix of anxiety and relief at the prospect of having his background revealed. The recognition would end his anonymity, but it would also provide protection against future harassment, and create opportunities for meaningful service that went beyond cooking breakfast. Third, we're going to recommend you for a Civilian Service Award that acknowledges your post-military contributions to the Pearl Harbor community. 15 years of excellent service deserve recognition, regardless of your previous military achievements. Captain Williams added, we've also discussed creating a position for you in our Veteran Outreach Program, if you're interested in expanding your role beyond mess hall operations. Your experience and perspective would be valuable for helping other veterans transition to civilian careers. Frank considered the implications of the changes that Hayes was proposing. His quiet life at Pearl Harbor would be transformed, but the transformation would allow him to serve in ways that utilized his experience and knowledge rather than simply his cooking skills. Admiral Frank said, I'm honored by your confidence in me, and I appreciate the opportunity to serve in new ways. But I want to continue working in the mess hall as well. Feeding people is important work, and I don't want to lose that connection to the daily life of the base. Hayes laughed, and the sound filled the conference room with warmth that reminded Frank of better times during their shared service. Frank, I wouldn't expect anything else from you. You can have both roles, cooking and mentoring, because both forms of service matter. The meeting continued for another hour, with details about implementation, timeline, and coordination with Tyler Brooks's command structure. By the time Frank left the conference room, his life at Pearl Harbor had been fundamentally changed, but in ways that honored his service while protecting his dignity. 2 days later, Frank found himself standing in front of a classroom filled with new recruits, including Tyler Brooks and several of his followers. The recruits sat with the rigid attention that came from recent conversations with their commanding officers about respect, discipline, and the consequences of failing to meet military standards. Frank had prepared carefully for the presentation, working with Admiral Hayes and the training staff to create content that would educate without lecturing, inspire without intimidating. He began by talking about military service as a continuum, a commitment that extended beyond active duty into civilian life and community service. When I retired from the Navy in 2007, Frank said, his voice carrying clearly through the classroom, I thought my service was over. I thought I would find a civilian job that had nothing to do with the military and start a completely new chapter of my life. Tyler Brooks sat in the front row, his posture reflecting the uncomfortable attention he had received from his commanding officers following the review of his social media activity. His phone had been confiscated, his videos removed, and his understanding of military discipline significantly enhanced through conversations that had made clear the potential consequences of his behavior. But I discovered something that I want to share with all of you, Frank continued. Service isn't just about wearing a uniform or carrying a weapon, or completing dangerous missions. Service is about contributing to something larger than yourself, about taking care of other people, about doing work that matters even when no one notices or thanks you for it. Frank told them about his decision to work in the mess hall, about finding purpose in feeding people who were serving their country, about the satisfaction that came from doing simple work with excellence and dedication. He talked about the connection between military values and civilian life, about carrying forward principles of honor, courage and commitment regardless of job title or recognition. Some of you might think that cooking breakfast is a step down from military operations, Frank said, looking directly at Tyler. But I've learned that feeding people who are serving their country is its own form of patriotism. Every meal I prepare helps someone do their job better, trains harder, serves more effectively. Then Frank told them about Operation Beacon Light, describing the mission in terms that honored classified restrictions, while conveying the reality of service under extreme conditions. He talked about making decisions under fire, about the weight of responsibility for other people's lives, about the satisfaction that came from saving people who were depending on military personnel for survival. The classroom was completely silent as Frank described pulling unconscious children from sinking boats, providing medical care to wounded refugees, while under hostile fire, making multiple trips into dangerous waters, because each trip meant saving lives that would otherwise be lost. I didn't tell you that story to impress you, Frank said, as he concluded his presentation. I told you that story because I want you to understand that military service creates obligations that extend far beyond your time in uniform. You have a responsibility to represent military values in everything you do, to treat other people with respect and dignity, to remember that actions have consequences that affect real people in real ways. Frank looked around the classroom, making eye contact with each recruit to ensure that his message was being received and understood. When you post videos or make jokes or treat other people as entertainment, you're representing the military community, whether you realize it or not. People judge all of us based on how each of us behaves. That's a responsibility that comes with wearing the uniform, and it's a responsibility that continues long after you take the uniform off. After the presentation, Tyler Brooks approached Frank with obvious nervousness, his earlier confidence replaced by genuine remorse and understanding. Mr. Martinez, sir, Tyler said, his voice reflecting sincerity that hadn't been present in any of their previous interactions. I wanted to apologize for the videos, and for not understanding who you really are. I removed all the content like they told me to, but I wanted to apologize personally, because what I did was wrong regardless of what anyone ordered me to do. Frank studied Tyler's face, seeing a young man who was beginning to understand the complexity of military service and the importance of treating others with respect and dignity. I appreciate that apology, Tyler, Frank said, and I accept it. But more importantly, I hope you've learned something about making assumptions about people based on their age or their job or anything else that doesn't tell the whole story. Tyler nodded earnestly. Yes, sir, I have. And I wanted to ask if maybe I could eat breakfast at your station sometimes, not for videos or anything, just to say thank you for your service and to show respect like I should have been doing all along. Frank smiled, recognizing the genuine desire for redemption in Tyler's request. You're welcome at my station anytime, son. That's what it's there for, feeding people who are serving their country. 6 months later, Frank Martinez had settled into his expanded role at Pearl Harbor, dividing his time between mess hall operations and veteran outreach programs. His story had become part of the base's institutional memory, a reminder that extraordinary people often choose ordinary-looking work, and that respect should be given based on character, rather than appearance or job title. Tyler Brooks had become one of Frank's most dedicated advocates, using his social media presence to promote respect for veterans and military service. His content had evolved from mockery to meaningful recognition of service members who contributed to military communities in ways that weren't always visible or celebrated. The mess hall at Building 47 had gained a reputation as a place where military values were honored and practiced, where people of all ranks and backgrounds could find excellent food prepared by someone who understood the importance of service in all its forms. Frank continued to arrive before dawn each morning, preparing breakfast for hungry sailors and Marines with the same dedication and skill that had characterized his approach to military operations. But now his work was recognized for what it had always been: another form of service, another way of contributing to the mission, another expression of the values that defined the best aspects of military life. The old cook's secret had become a story of hidden heroism revealed, of respect earned through quiet service, of the extraordinary courage that ordinary-looking people carry within themselves. Frank Martinez had demonstrated that true heroes often choose humility over recognition, service over self-promotion, and dignity over revenge. His legacy at Pearl Harbor would continue long after his eventual retirement, inspiring service members to look beyond appearances, to treat others with respect regardless of their position or age, and to understand that military service creates obligations and opportunities that extend far beyond active duty. Frank's story had reminded everyone who heard it that heroism comes in many forms, that service is a choice that must be made every day, and that the values worth fighting for are also worth living by in the quiet moments, when no one is watching and no cameras are recording. In the end, the recruits who had laughed at the old cook learned that some people's dignity masks extraordinary courage, that assumptions based on appearance are often wrong, and that respect should be given freely to those who have earned it through service, sacrifice, and the daily choice to make other people's lives better. Frank Martinez had shown them what it really meant to be a hero, not through dramatic gestures or public recognition, but through consistent excellence, quiet dignity, and the understanding that true service means putting other people's needs before your own, regardless of whether anyone notices or thanks you for it. The old cook's secret had become a lesson in values, character, and the profound impact that one person can have when they choose to serve others with humility, competence, and unwavering dedication to doing the right thing. 3 months after Admiral Hayes's revelation about Frank Martinez's extraordinary service record, the Pearl Harbor Naval Station had undergone subtle but profound changes that reflected a renewed understanding of what military service truly meant. The transformation wasn't immediately visible to casual observers, but those who paid attention could see it in the way people interacted with each other, the level of respect shown to all personnel, regardless of rank or position, and the growing awareness that heroism often wore ordinary faces. Frank continued his dual role as head breakfast cook and veteran liaison, a combination that had proven more natural and effective than anyone had anticipated. His morning still began before dawn in the familiar environment of Building 47's kitchen, where he prepared meals with the same meticulous attention to quality that had characterized his work for 15 years. But now his interactions with customers carried additional weight, as word had spread throughout the base about his decorated military background, and the circumstances that had led to his current position. The breakfast rush had evolved into something resembling a daily gathering of respect and recognition, with personnel from across the base making deliberate choices to eat at Frank's station not just for the excellent food, but for the opportunity to express their appreciation for his service. Young recruits approached his griddle with genuine courtesy, often thanking him not only for their meals but for his years of military service. Experienced sailors and officers made time to engage in brief conversations that acknowledged Frank's background while respecting his preference for humble service over elaborate recognition. Tyler Brooks had become one of Frank's most frequent customers and unlikely advocates, arriving early most mornings to help with prep work before his regular training schedule began. The transformation in Tyler's character had been remarkable to witness, as the young man who had once mocked Frank's age and position now sought every opportunity to learn from someone he'd come to recognize as a living example of military values and personal integrity. On this particular morning, Tyler was helping Frank organize ingredients for the breakfast rush while discussing his plans for using social media to promote respect for veterans and military service. Tyler's online presence had evolved dramatically from his earlier content, focusing now on educational material about military history, veteran services, and the importance of recognizing service members who continued contributing to their communities after retirement. Mr. Martinez, Tyler said as he arranged bacon strips on the industrial griddle. I've been thinking about doing a series of interviews with veterans who work in civilian positions on base, not for entertainment, but to help people understand the depth of experience and service that's all around us, if we just pay attention. Frank nodded approvingly as he checked the coffee brewing systems and adjusted temperatures for optimal extraction. That sounds like a meaningful project, Tyler. But remember what we've discussed about consent and respect. Make sure everyone you interview is comfortable with sharing their stories, and focus on the lessons rather than the drama. Tyler had learned those principles through months of mentoring from Frank, who had helped the young recruit understand the difference between exploiting people for content and creating material that honored their experiences while educating others. The transformation had been gradual but genuine, reflecting Tyler's growing maturity and understanding of responsibility that came with any form of public platform. I've already talked to Chief Chen about featuring the mess hall staff, Tyler continued, and she suggested that I include people from different departments so the series shows the full range of veteran contributions to base operations. Sarah Chen had become an enthusiastic supporter of Tyler's reformed approach to social media, recognizing the potential for positive impact when young service members used their platforms to promote military values, rather than undermine them. Her own role had expanded beyond mess hall supervision to include coordination with the base's public affairs office, helping to develop policies for appropriate social media use that balanced free expression with military discipline and respect. As the breakfast rush began, Frank noticed the familiar patterns that had developed since his background had become known throughout the Pearl Harbor community. The line at his station was consistently longer than other breakfast options, not because his food had improved, but because people wanted to be served by someone whose story had reminded them of the extraordinary dedication that orderly-looking service could represent. Admiral Hayes had become a regular customer during his visits to Pearl Harbor, making a point of eating breakfast at Frank's station whenever his schedule allowed. This morning was one of those occasions, and Frank could see the Admiral approaching with his usual purposeful stride, accompanied by a woman in civilian clothes whom Frank didn't recognize. "Good morning, Frank," Admiral Hayes said as he reached the griddle. "I'd like you to meet Dr. Patricia Reeves from the Veterans Administration. She's been working on a program that I think might interest you." Dr. Reeves extended her hand with a warm smile that suggested genuine appreciation for Frank's service and current work. "Mr. Martinez, Admiral Hayes has told me remarkable things about your transition from military service to civilian contribution. I'm hoping we can discuss some opportunities for expanding your veteran outreach work beyond Pearl Harbor." Frank accepted Dr. Reeves' handshake while continuing to manage the breakfast orders that were backing up behind Admiral Hayes. "I'm honored by your interest, Dr. Reeves, but I hope you'll understand that my primary commitment is to the people I serve here every morning." Dr. Reeves laughed, and Frank could see that she appreciated his dedication to his current responsibilities. "That's exactly the attitude that makes you perfect for what we're planning. We're developing a program that would allow veterans like you to share your experience and wisdom with other military communities, while maintaining your current position. Think of it as consulting work that travels to you rather than taking you away from your regular duties." Admiral Hayes ordered his usual breakfast while Dr. Reeves explained the Veterans Administration's initiative to identify and support veterans who had successfully transitioned to meaningful civilian service. The program aimed to create a network of mentors and advisors who could help other veterans navigate the challenges of post-military life, while continuing to contribute to military communities. "Your story has already had significant impact here at Pearl Harbor." Dr. Reeves continued as Frank prepared their meals. We've received reports about improved morale, increased respect for veteran employees, and better understanding among young service members about the long-term commitment that military service represents. Frank handed over their breakfast trays with his characteristic efficiency, but he was clearly processing the implications of Dr. Reeves's proposal. The opportunity to help other veterans while maintaining his work at Pearl Harbor was appealing, but he remained cautious about commitments that might compromise his ability to serve his current community effectively. "I'd be interested in learning more," Frank said carefully, "but I want to make sure that any additional responsibilities don't interfere with my duties here or create unrealistic expectations about what I can accomplish." Dr. Reeves nodded understandingly. "We've learned from experience that the most effective veteran mentors are those who remain grounded in meaningful daily work. Your cooking isn't separate from your mentoring, Frank. It's part of what makes your mentoring authentic and valuable." Admiral Hayes added, "Frank, this program could help hundreds of veterans across the Pacific Fleet. Your example of finding purpose and dignity in post-military service could change lives in ways that extend far beyond what you've already accomplished here." As Admiral Hayes and Dr. Reeves found seats to continue their conversation over breakfast, Frank returned his attention to the steady stream of customers who depended on him for their morning meals. But his mind was processing the possibilities that Dr. Reeves had outlined, weighing his desire to help other veterans against his commitment to the Pearl Harbor community that had become his primary focus. Tyler Brooks had observed the conversation with Admiral Hayes and Dr. Reeves, and as the breakfast rush began to slow, he approached Frank with obvious curiosity about the discussion. "Mr. Martinez, that sounded like they were offering you some kind of promotion or new position. Are you thinking about leaving the mess hall?" Frank smiled at Tyler's concern, recognizing the genuine affection and respect that had developed between them over the months since Tyler's transformation from antagonist to advocate. "No, Tyler, I'm not leaving, but I am thinking about ways to help other veterans while continuing the work I do here. Sometimes opportunities come along that allow you to expand your service without abandoning your current commitments." Tyler nodded, clearly relieved that Frank wouldn't be leaving Pearl Harbor. "Would this new program involve travel? Because I know a lot of people here depend on you being available for advice and support." Frank appreciated Tyler's consideration for the broader Pearl Harbor community that had come to rely on Frank's presence and wisdom. The young recruit had developed a sophisticated understanding of how Frank's various roles interconnected and supported each other. "Any travel would be minimal," Frank explained, "and it would be designed to support what I'm already doing rather than replace it. The idea is to help other military bases develop their own veteran support programs using lessons learned from what we've built here." As they talked, other kitchen staff and regular customers began gathering around Frank's station, drawn by the discussion of his potential expanded role. The conversation had evolved into an informal community meeting, with people sharing their thoughts about Frank's impact on Pearl Harbor, and their hopes for how his influence might reach other military communities. Chief Sarah Chen joined the group, bringing with her the administrative perspective that had been crucial in supporting Frank's transition from anonymous cook to recognized veteran leader. "Frank," Sarah said, "whatever you decide about this new opportunity, I want you to know that your work here has changed how this entire base thinks about veteran service and civilian contribution. That's an achievement that extends far beyond any individual program or recognition." Frank looked around at the faces surrounding his griddle, seeing young recruits like Tyler, who had learned important lessons about respect and service, experienced personnel, who had gained new appreciation for the veterans working alongside them, and colleagues who had been inspired by his example of finding dignity and purpose in humble work. "The truth is," Frank said, addressing the group that had gathered around him, "everything I've been able to accomplish here has been possible because of the support and respect you've all shown me. If this new program can help other veterans experience the same kind of community acceptance and meaningful work that I found at Pearl Harbor, then it's worth pursuing." Dr. Reeves had finished her breakfast and returned to Frank's station, clearly pleased by the community support that was evident in the gathering around his griddle. "Mr. Martinez, this is exactly what we hoped to see. The most effective veteran programs are those that grow out of genuine community relationships rather than top-down administrative initiatives. What you've built here is organic, sustainable, and transferable to other locations." Admiral Hayes joined Dr. Reeves, adding his perspective on the broader implications of Frank's work at Pearl Harbor. "Frank, your story has already influenced policy discussions at the highest levels of Navy leadership. The combination of your military record and your civilian service has become a model for how we think about veteran transition and ongoing contribution to military communities." Frank felt the weight of responsibility that came with recognition, but also the satisfaction of knowing that his choices had created positive impact beyond his immediate work environment. The decision to work at Pearl Harbor had been motivated by personal needs for meaningful service and peaceful routine, but it had evolved into something larger and more significant than he had ever imagined. "Admiral Dr. Reeves," Frank said, "I'm honored by your confidence in me, and I'm committed to helping other veterans in whatever way I can. But I want to make sure we design this program in a way that supports rather than compromises the local work that remains my primary focus." Over the following weeks, Frank worked with Dr. Reeves and the Veterans Administration to develop a consultation program that would allow him to share his experience with other military installations while maintaining his full-time commitment to Pearl Harbor. The program involved periodic video conferences with Veteran Services coordinators, written materials that captured lessons learned from his transition experience, and occasional visits to nearby bases where his presence could help launch similar veteran integration initiatives. Tyler Brooks documented Frank's expanded role through carefully planned social media content that highlighted the importance of veteran services and the potential for positive impact when military communities embraced the continued contributions of retired personnel. Tyler's content had gained national attention within military social media circles, establishing him as a voice for respectful recognition of veteran service and civilian contribution. The program's first major success came when Frank consulted with Naval Air Station Lemoore in California, where veteran employees had been experiencing similar challenges with recognition and respect from younger personnel. Frank's video conference sessions with Lemoore staff helped them develop policies and programs that improved veteran integration while educating active duty personnel about the value of experienced civilian colleagues. 6 months after Dr. Reeves's initial visit, Frank had consulted with 12 military installations across the Pacific, helping to establish veteran mentorship programs that combined meaningful work opportunities with community recognition and support. The success of these programs had attracted attention from congressional representatives aided in veteran services, leading to invitations for Frank to testify about effective approaches to veteran transition and community integration. Frank's testimony before a House subcommittee on veteran affairs was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in Washington, D.C., requiring his first extended absence from Pearl Harbor since beginning his work there 17 years earlier. The prospect of leaving his kitchen, even temporarily, created anxiety for Frank that reminded him of how deeply he had become connected to his daily routine and community relationships. Tyler Brooks had volunteered to help coordinate Frank's travel and testimony preparation, using his social media skills to document the process while respecting Frank's privacy and the serious nature of congressional proceedings. Tyler's growth from internet provocateur to thoughtful advocate had become a parallel story that illustrated the transformative power of mentorship and genuine respect. On the morning of Frank's departure for Washington, the Pearl Harbor mess hall was filled with personnel who had come to wish him well and express their appreciation for his service to their community. The gathering was spontaneous and emotional, reflecting the deep connections that Frank had built through years of consistent excellence and authentic care for the people he served. Admiral Hayes spoke briefly to the assembled crowd, acknowledging Frank's impact on Pearl Harbor and the broader military community that would benefit from his testimony and advocacy work. Frank Martinez represents the best of what military service can become when it transitions from active duty to civilian contribution, Admiral Hayes said. His example reminds us that heroism isn't limited to combat operations, that service can take many forms, and that respect should be based on character and contribution rather than rank or recognition. Frank's response to the send-off gathering was characteristically humble, focusing on gratitude for community support rather than personal achievement. I never expected to find the kind of meaningful work and genuine friendships that I've discovered here at Pearl Harbor, Frank said. If my testimony in Washington can help other veterans experience the same sense of purpose and community acceptance, then everything we've built together will have impact far beyond what any of us imagined when this journey began. Tyler Brooks captured Frank's departure with social media content that emphasized the significance of veteran advocacy and the importance of congressional support for effective transition programs. The content reached audiences far beyond military communities, creating broader public awareness of veteran issues and the potential for positive impact when communities embrace the continued service of retired military personnel. Frank's congressional testimony was well received by representatives from both parties, who recognized the practical value of his experience and the potential for cost-effective veteran programs based on his model of community integration and meaningful work opportunities. His recommendations for policy changes that would support similar programs at military installations nationwide were incorporated to legislation that passed with bipartisan support 6 months later. When Frank returned to Pearl Harbor, after his successful advocacy work in Washington, he was greeted by a community that had gained even deeper appreciation for his contributions and the national significance of what they had built together. His kitchen had been maintained by colleagues during his absence, and his return to the breakfast griddle was celebrated with the kind of genuine warmth that reflected authentic relationships rather than ceremonial recognition. The months that followed brought steady expansion of Frank's consulting work, with military installations across the country requesting his guidance for veteran integration programs. Each consultation reinforced his understanding that the key to successful veteran transition was community acceptance combined with meaningful work opportunities that utilized military experience while respecting individual choices about service level and recognition. Tyler Brooks had gained admission to a military communications program that would allow him to continue his advocacy work for veteran recognition, while developing professional skills in public affairs and social media strategy. His transformation from Frank's antagonist to advocate had become a case study in the power of mentorship and the importance of second chances for young people who were willing to learn from their mistakes. As Frank approached his 18th year of service at Pearl Harbor, he reflected on the unexpected journey that had taken him from anonymous cook to national advocate for veteran services. His daily routine remained centered on preparing excellent breakfast for hungry service members, but that work now carried additional meaning as an example of how meaningful civilian service could honor military experience while contributing to community well-being. The old cook's secret had become a story of hidden heroism revealed, of community respect earned through consistent excellence, and of the extraordinary impact that ordinary-looking service could achieve when supported by genuine relationships and shared values. Frank Martinez had demonstrated that true leadership often involved choosing humility over recognition, service over self-promotion, and daily excellence over dramatic gestures. His legacy at Pearl Harbor and beyond would continue to influence military communities long after his eventual retirement, inspiring veterans to find purpose in civilian service while educating active duty personnel about the importance of respecting all forms of contribution to military missions and community life. Frank's story had reminded everyone who heard it that heroism comes in many forms, that service is a daily choice rather than a temporary assignment, and that the values worth defending in combat are also worth living by in the quiet moments when no cameras are recording and no medals are being awarded. In the end, the recruits who had laughed at the old cook learned that dignity and courage often wear ordinary faces, that assumptions based on appearance are frequently wrong, and that respect should be given freely to those who have earned it through service, sacrifice, and the daily choice to make other people's lives better. Frank Martinez had shown them what it really meant to be a hero, not through dramatic declarations or public recognition, but through consistent excellence, quiet dignity, and the profound understanding that true service means putting other people's needs before your own, regardless of whether anyone notices or thanks you for the effort. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.